I once swiped left on my husband on Tinder. It was about 8 years ago, and the dating apps were new. I saw this guy who I recognized a little bit from college. We had met 7 years before, but I decided that he seemed like too much of a bro, and I didn't think that we'd have a lot in common, and so I swiped left. At the time, I was single and I was struggling. And I saw that the people around me were struggling too. Who should we go out with? How do we choose among all these people? How do we know if we're making the right decision? And my pattern at the time was that I was actually chasing after people who weren't interested in me, a pattern that I now realize is very common. And after going through this cycle after cycle, I realized that I needed help. And I actually sought out advice from a dating coach. And when I met with this dating coach, she helped me identify what was going on for me. She helped me realize my patterns. And she made me do this exercise. How do you want your partner to make you feel? And I realized that I wanted my partner to make me feel desired, accepted, appreciated, and secure. And that was not at all how the guys I had been chasing were making me feel. In fact, I spent most of my time worrying, would they ever call me back? Were they interested? What did this text message mean? What were we going to do that weekend? Would I ever hear from them again? When we went through that exercise, I actually realized that there already was someone in my life who made me feel that way. Yep, it was that guy, Scott, the guy from work who I had met in college about 7 or 8 years before and who I then reconnected with. And I realized that Scott was the guy who I would call after my dates and complain about the different people I was going out with. But in the end, he was the one I should be dating. He was the one who made me feel great. And so I was able to transition that friendship into something more. And we actually got married last summer. So this experience with the dating coach, it really opened my eyes. It showed me that I was making this fundamental mistake in how I was looking for people, right? I had this view of love, that love is chasing someone and that a guy would always pull away and then I would convince him to date me and eventually I would marry one of these people. And instead, she really shifted my mindset to show me that it was about what side of me that person brought out. And this helped me understand not just one mistake, but the fact that we were all making a lot of mistakes. So while I was single and looking for love, I was also working at Google. I was running a behavioral science team called the Irrational Lab. And behavioral science is the study of how we make decisions. And so I thought, how could I combine these two things? How could I combine my interest in psychology and how our brains work and decision-making theory with all of these problems we were having with dating and relationships? And that's actually what I've been doing for the last few years. I've been applying behavioral science insights to dating and relationships to help people make better decisions. And what that's looked like is dating coaching, matchmaking, and now writing a book. And in this talk, I'm really excited to share some of the best lessons I've learned about how you can get out of your own way and find love. In my work as a dating coach, a matchmaker, and now the director of relationship science at Hinge, I've noticed that there's some very common patterns that hold people back. Today, I'm going to tell you about 3 common dating myths, and then together we're going to bust each of them. Fuck the type, fuck the spark, and fuck happily ever after. Myth number 1, the type. A few years ago, I had a singles dating party in San Francisco. This was a straight event. I invited 27 men and 27 women. At the end of the event, when everyone had had a chance to meet each other, I asked people who they wanted to go out with again. And over 70 dates came out of that party. When I followed up with a survey, I asked people, is this the type of person who you would have swiped right on if you'd seen them on the app? I was fascinated by the responses. They said, no, I wouldn't have swiped right on them because I literally wouldn't have seen them on my app because of my filters. What they mean by this is that some men were like, I wouldn't have seen this woman because I filter out for age. Some women said, I wouldn't have seen this guy because I filter for race and religion. A lot of people have these really strict filters and they limit who you see on the app. And the reason why that's a problem is because we're often wrong about what will make us happy long term. And so if you have this idea in your head of the type, and you feel like I only need to find that 6 foot tall businessman or that woman who's as ambitious as me and makes 6 figures a year, consider that you might be wrong. So many people wind up with someone who is not their type. In fact, in dating coaching, when someone tells me, oh, I'm dating this guy and, he's not my usual type, that's often when I think it's going to work out because it means that they broke a bad habit. So the key takeaway here, it's possible that even though you have this idea of the type, that's not the type of person who would make you happiest long term. Here's what you can do about it. Change who you go out with. I want you to be more open-minded about who you see on the apps. So I want you to change the filters, and I want you to be more open-minded about who you actually go on a date with. Now, giving up on your type is not settling. I'm not saying that you should be with someone who's not interesting to you or someone that you don't love. I'm merely letting you know that many of the happiest couples are two people who didn't think they would wind up together. Be a scientist, change your filters, and give people a chance. Myth number 2, the spark. Fuck the spark. Okay, so now you've matched with someone and you're actually on the date. Here's what's wrong with the spark. First of all, people think that the spark can't grow over time. That's not true. The spark can and often does grow. I had this client named Jonathan, and he used to go on date after date with great guys, people who were really good matches for him. And then he would call me afterwards and tell me all of the interesting things that they talked about and how fun their day was. And then he'd say, I'm not going to go out with them again. I just didn't feel the spark. This frustrates me so much. This is why the spark has become my nemesis. The spark is that idea of that initial pang of excitement. It's the fireworks. It's the lightning bolt. It's when the whole room stops and you can only focus on the person in front of you. And while the spark is a great thing, research shows that only 11% of people feel love at first sight. And in fact, many of the best relationships are from people who were friends first. There's something called the mere exposure effect. It means that the more we're exposed to something, the more we see it, the more we like it. That's why people often end up dating somebody from work or somebody who lived on the hallway of their sophomore dorm. Another problem is that people think if I feel the spark, then this must be a good thing. That's just not true. Plenty of really hot, charismatic, and yes, narcissistic people give off the spark. And so while you might think that it's something that developed between the two of you and that's what the spark is, the spark can actually just be something that that person gives a lot of people. Some people are just really sparky, and this is more of a reflection on them and how they show up in the world than what's developing between the two of you. So even if you feel the spark, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good thing. It might just be a reflection of who that person is. The other part of this is that it's really easy to confuse anxiety for chemistry. That's what was happening to me before I met my husband. I would chase after these guys. They weren't interested in me. They would pull away. And what I was actually feeling was anxiety, but I confused it for chemistry. And so keep in mind that the spark is not always a good thing. Another mistake that I see people making is thinking that if you have the spark, the relationship is viable. Plenty of divorced couples started with the spark. And so just because you had an amazing how we met story, it doesn't mean that this is the person you should be with. Don't let the right beginning lead you to the wrong relationship. Here's what you should do instead. Fuck the spark and go after the slow burn. Now, I'm not saying that the spark is always a bad thing, but a lot of great people just don't spark on the first date. And that's why you should make the second date the default. You should make a rule where you always go on the second date with somebody unless something dramatic happens on the first date. What that means is that you're giving yourself a chance to be exposed to those people who take longer to open up. Those are the diamond in the rough people. Those are the slow burns. The slow burn is that person who might not be initially charismatic, but they would make a great long-term partner. They're kind, they're loyal, they're reliable. These are people who you like more and more every time you see them, as opposed to that really sparky person where after the first few times you realize that they're kind of putting on an act. So remember, the spark can grow over time. Some people are just really sparky, and the presence of a spark doesn't mean that the relationship is going to last long term. Here's the third and final myth I'm going to bust for you. The myth of the happily ever after. Congratulations. Now you're in a relationship. The hard work is over, right? Wrong. I call this the happily ever after fallacy. The mistaken belief that the hard work of love is finding someone. That's just not true. Unfortunately, that's when the hard work begins. Where does this idea come from? I think it has a lot to do with romantic comedies and Disney fairy tales in which the entire movie is about the two people trying to get together. And at the end of the movie, after trials and tribulations, they're finally together and we expect them to live, say it with me now, happily ever after. That's just not the case. So much research shows that good relationships require people to invest in them. I had a client named Maya. She was the quintessential romanticizer. That's somebody who expects to find their soulmate. They think there's one person out there for me and I just need to have them find me and then it'll all work out. She wasn't willing to put effort into dating apps or finding someone. She thought love is something that happens to you. And so she would get dressed up for a flight, but she wouldn't approach someone because she thought that that was unromantic. Or she wouldn't use dating apps because she also thought that that was unromantic. In Maya's mind, she would go to a farmer's market, she would reach for a tomato, and at the exact same time, so would somebody else, and boom, they would fall in love, there would be that spark, and they would live happily ever after. And Maya had what's called the soulmate mindset, the idea that love is effortless when you find the right person. And that's just not true. Love requires work. What I told Maya to do and what I recommend to all of you is to shift to something called the work it out mindset. This is the idea that love requires effort and that if it feels like work, you're doing it right. Dr. John Gottman is one of the forefathers of the field of relationship science. He spent over 40 years researching what separates the relationship masters, couples who are successful and happy together, from the relationship disasters, couples that break up or are together miserably. Some of his most interesting research took place in the Love Lab. This was an apartment in Seattle that was decked out. It had cameras, it had microphones, it even had something called the jiggleometer that was under a chair to see how much you moved while you were sitting in it. And what he would do was he would invite couples to spend the weekend there, and he would study their behavior. And he and his team identified something called bids. These are verbal or nonverbal attempts to connect. And so a famous example from his research is that somebody stands by the window and says, "Oh, look at that boat go by." And they measure what does the person's partner do in response. They might turn towards the person, which means they would stand up and say, "Oh, what a great boat," and start a conversation about it. Or they would turn away from them and they would either ignore them or say something unkind like, "Can't you see I'm reading the newspaper? Why are you interrupting me?" And what he found when he looked at these couples 6 years later was that the couples who were the relationship masters, the couples who stayed together, they turned towards each other 86% of the time. And the couples who were the relationship disasters, they only turned towards each other 33% of the time. And what this shows you is that so much of love and finding a great long-term relationship is what John Gottman calls small things often. It's about putting in that work. It's not the grand gesture. It's about every day making bids to connect with your partner and turning towards their attempts to connect. And so the main idea here is that if your relationship feels like work, that's a good thing. So forget the happily ever after and focus on investing in your relationship. So in conclusion, remember, fuck the type, fuck the spark, and fuck happily ever after. I imagine a world in which people stop caring about the things that don't matter and start investing into their dating lives and their relationships to form the partnerships of their dreams. Strong relationships don't appear by accident. They reflect a series of great decisions along the way. And so my goal for you is to adopt this philosophy of intentional love. The idea is you're in the driver's seat of your life and of your relationship. Be intentional along the way. Be self-aware about who you are, what you're looking for, what type of people you're choosing, and the type of relationship you want to be in. As I did the research for my book, these were the people who inspired me most, the people who gave up the type, the people who went for the slow burn, the people who found that diamond in the rough. And so my wish for you today is to give up the happily ever after and to instead focus on living intentionally ever after. If we were together live, and trust me, I wish we were, now's the point at which I would answer your questions. Since we can't do that, I've solicited questions from the internet, and now I'm going to answer them. Here's the first one. Can you speak to research specifically done on the LGBTQ plus community? In other words, is your book relevant to me? Okay, so this is actually how I start my book. In the author's note, I say, here's the bad news. A lot of research done on couples is done on straight couples. That's the unfortunate thing. But here's the good news. When that research has been replicated to include LGBTQ plus individuals, what we see is that many of the main ideas translate. And that's because so much of what we're talking about is universal. It's universally true that you should be intentional about how you approach your life. It's universally true that it's better to be upfront and honest than to be unclear and find out things you didn't want to discover later. It's universally true that many of us are looking for a partner and that it's worthwhile to invest in that process and invest in the relationship once we have it. For my book specifically, I made the effort to talk to people of all different types of orientations, identity, and experiences. And you'll see lots of different love stories reflected in my book. Here's the next question. When I date someone, I like to call it early. If I'm not interested in them, I move on. My friends accuse me of ghosting, but it's nicer to just fade away than outright reject someone, right? Well, in a word, no. First of all, if you know anything about me, you know that I'm anti-ghosting. Ghosting is what Hinge users have identified as the #1 biggest problem in modern dating. And the reason why ghosting is so bad is that it hurts people. It makes you live in this sea of ambiguity where you don't know where you stand. You don't know if you should keep holding on for another date or if the person is just not interested at all. And so the first thing that I would say is that it's not true that ghosting is more painful than outright rejecting someone. In fact, at Hinge, we found that 84% of people say, let me know. I'd rather know and be hurt in the moment than be ghosted. And so from now on, I really hope that you stop ghosting and you start telling people that you're not interested. Here's the type of text message you can say. Hey, person I went on a date with. It was great to meet you, but I don't think we're a romantic match. That's kind, firm, and clear. And it's helping someone understand where they stand with you. So as soon as you know you're not interested in someone, let them know. Don't ghost. When choosing a long-term partner, which trade-offs should you feel comfortable taking, and which ones should you not feel comfortable taking? Okay, well, the first way I want to answer this question is by talking about deal breakers. What I found working with tons of different people is that people often confuse deal breakers with pet peeve. So a deal breaker would be something like you want to have kids and your partner absolutely doesn't. Or it's important to you to raise your kids in your religion and your partner has a different one and wants to raise the kids in that. A pet peeve is something that's annoying to you, perhaps more annoying to you than it is to other people, but it's not a deal breaker. It's not something that truly prevents you from being in a relationship. And so the first thing to do is to understand, is this a deal breaker or is it a PPP, a permissible pet peeve? And you don't want to lose a great relationship because you confused a deal breaker for a PPP. The next thing I can tell you is here's what matters and here's what really doesn't in long-term relationships. And so a lot of people focus on things like looks, money, having similar personalities, and having shared hobbies. And while those things are important, they're often way less important than people think they are. And I know this because when people come to me for matchmaking and dating coaching, they often point to these things as really critical. But that's not what the science says. Here's what relationship science tells us matters most for long-term relationship success. It might seem obvious, but I'm telling you, this is not what people tell me they're prioritizing when they sit down on my couch or on my Zoom and come to talk to me. First of all, loyalty, then kindness, emotional stability, a growth mindset, the ability to make hard decisions together, and what's really become the most important to me, what side of you they bring out. And so as you're going through dating and as you're entering different relationships, really pay attention to the stuff that matters long term. So throw out those permissible pet peeves and understand what are your deal breakers and what are the things that really matter long term. I am considering moving in with my girlfriend. When's the right time to do that? So dating and love and relationships, everything we're talking about today, it's an art and a science. That means that there's no clear-cut answer for you and your girlfriend about the right time to move in together. But here's what I can tell you. Relationship researchers refer to 2 different ways that couples can go through relationship transitions. One is called deciding and one is called sliding. Couples who slide, they just are on the relationship escalator and they go from one stage of relationship to the next and they don't really think about it. And so these are the couples who say things like, oh, my lease is up and I'm spending a lot of time at your apartment. Should I just move in? The other type of couple is those who decide. And these are people who have intentional conversations at every step of the way. And the research is clear. Couples who decide are happier, more successful, and have better sex than those who slide through relationship transitions. And so what you and your girlfriend should do is have an honest conversation about what this moment means to each of you. Maybe you think that moving in together is a path towards marriage, but for her, it's just a way to explore, is this the right relationship for me? So make sure that you're intentional about understanding what does moving in together mean for you? Are you doing it for the right reasons? And are you on the same page about where you are now and where you're headed? So decide, don't slide. You talk a lot about how to find the right person, but how do you actually know if you're in the right relationship? I love this question. Thank you for asking it. And really, one of the most surprising parts of my job is something called breakup consulting. And this is not something that I ever could have predicted I would pursue when I started this role. And so what that means is from time to time, I get a phone call from someone who says, I'm in this relationship. I don't know if it's the right relationship for me. Should I stay or should I go? First of all, a lot of times when these people call me, I have to say, they are looking for permission to leave the relationship that they're in, and they oftentimes have already made the decision to leave. They just want someone else to say it's okay. But here's how I'm going to explain it to you on a broad level. There's something called a ditcher and something called a hitcher. Now, a ditcher is somebody who tends to be in relationships for a short period of time. And the problem with the ditcher is that they don't understand that if your long-term goal is to be in a long-term relationship, you have to eventually choose someone, commit to it, and see how it goes. The other type of person that I see commonly is a hitcher. And these are the types of people who stay in relationships for too long. And so that's who I get a lot of phone calls from. People who say, I've been dating this guy for 8 years. We started dating in high school. It felt really great then. Now I fear that I've outgrown the relationship. Oftentimes, I ask hitchers this question that I call the wardrobe test question. And if you're listening and wondering if you should break out of a relationship, tell me your gut reaction to this question. If your partner were a piece of clothing in your closet, something that you own, what would they be? What did you say? I've heard so many different responses. I've heard people say, my partner is a wool sweater. He keeps me warm, but then I want to take it off because it's itchy. Or I've heard people say, my partner is a scrubby old t-shirt that I would wear to the gym, but I wouldn't want somebody to see me in. Now, with both of those responses, you can see what somebody was really feeling. And that's why this question, even though it seems silly, is actually really important because it helps you get at that abstract feeling of what's going on for you, as opposed to just doing that pro-con list. There's also some really lovely answers I've heard. My personal answer is that my husband is like my favorite pair of onesie pajamas. They were a gift from a friend and they make me feel really cozy and like I'm wearing a hug and like I'm at home. This question, the wardrobe test, it really helps you understand what's going on for you beneath the surface. So for hitchers, I would say your historical tendency, what you tend to do is stay in relationships too long. How are you actually feeling about the relationship? Is there something external going on, something like a job loss, mental health stuff? Maybe this person has something going on that's going to go away in a few months, and then would you want to be with them? Don't leave too quickly. And have you put in all the effort that you can? Have you actually made the effort to try to make things better? And depending on the answer to those things, sometimes the response is that it's actually time for the hitcher to leave and for them to realize that getting out of a bad or mediocre relationship is oftentimes the best way to get into a good one. So if you're listening at home, the questions for you are you a hitcher or a ditcher? Is there something external going on that might change? Can you put more into the relationship? And would you be better off staying and investing or moving on to the next one and starting anew? I hope this is helpful. When you know you're ready to meet someone, how can you communicate that without coming across too strong? This is a question that I get all the time. You're ready to be an intentional dater, but how do you tell someone this without seeming too intense? And I do think that that's a smart instinct. I remember I was at a book dinner where I would give people different chapters of my book to read to give me feedback before it came out. And one guy said to me, sometimes when I go on dates with women, I feel like they're interviewing me for the job of husband. And what he meant by that was not just that the dates were kind of sterile and felt like job interviews, but he felt like these women had put a lot of effort into deciding that they were ready to settle down. And then they were really just seeing, does he fit the role? And so that's why my advice for this is to come across as self-aware and curious and not needy. Here's the type of thing you might say. Hey, I've been dating for a while and I feel like I really know myself. I want to get married and have kids in the next few years. What about you? What's been going on for you in your dating life lately? Specifically, you're saying, this is what I want, and you're creating space for the other person to tell you what they want. Thank you very much for watching this talk. Now, it wouldn't be a coaching session with me unless it ended with a homework assignment. So if you're single, I want you to think, what is one bad dating habit that's holding you back that you can work with a friend on changing? And if you're in a relationship, what is one thing you can do today to invest more into your partnership? Now go out there and do it.